In the long summers of the late 14th century, the villages of medieval Europe baked under an unforgiving sun. The air smelled of hay and sweat, of clay ovens and damp wool, and the heat clung to the body like a second skin. Life did not stop because of the weather. There were no cold baths waiting, no soap as we know it, no clean linen to change into every morning. For the women of those times, summer was both a test of endurance and a quiet lesson in adaptation. They woke before sunrise, when the air was still cool enough to breathe without discomfort. The first sound in many homes was the grinding of grain, the crackle of the hearth being coaxed back to life. Women tied their hair high, wrapping it in strips of cloth to keep it from sticking to their necks. Long layers of wool or linen were their only garments, heavy, modest, and suffocating under the midday sun. To wash those clothes daily was unthinkable. Water was precious, and labor was constant. Instead, they aired the garments at dawn or dusk, hanging them near open windows or over wooden rails so the wind could lift away some of the day's sweat. Hygiene was a matter of ingenuity. With no running water, most washing happened at riversides or wells shared by the entire village. Bathing was rare, a luxury of time and resources. A woman might bathe fully only a few times each season, often in wooden tubs filled with water warmed by the sun. More often, she wiped her body with rough linen cloths dampened with water and herbs, rosemary, lavender, or mint, when such things could be found. These herbs did not just cleanse, they masked the natural scent of life in a world without perfume or soap. By midday, the heat was thick and the world slowed down. The men worked the fields shirtless, but the women remained covered. It was both modesty and protection. Bare skin burned quickly, and dark fabric, though suffocating, shielded them from the fierce sun. Beneath the layers, they used simple tricks: small linen pants tucked under the arms, bits of wool near the neck or chest to absorb sweat. These would later be rinsed and dried in the evening air. No one spoke of these things aloud. Cleanliness was a silent labor, private and unseen. Inside the cottages, the air was heavy with the smell of cooking and humanity. Floors were dirt, sometimes covered with reeds or straw that would be changed when the smell became unbearable. The women sprinkled dried herbs and flowers across the ground, not for beauty, but to keep insects away. Mint for flies, wormwood for fleas, lavender for a sweetness that lifted the spirit. Every few weeks, when they could, they burned old rushes in the fireplace, letting the smoke drift through the rooms, believing it carried away sickness and foul air. Hair, for many women, was both pride and burden. Washing it took time and patience. Without shampoo, they used ash or crushed herbs mixed with water to scrub the scalp. Some rubbed vinegar through their hair, both to clean and to keep lice at bay. They combed it with wooden or bone combs, sometimes passing them through hot water to kill whatever might cling to the teeth. When they were done, they braided their hair tightly and wrapped it again, protecting it from dust and sun. In villages near rivers, the women were luckier. They could wade into the shallows, gather in groups, and laugh while scrubbing clothes against stones. But even there, bathing was done discreetly. To show too much skin was shameful, even among other women. So they wore thin shifts, garments that clung to their bodies, but allowed them to wash beneath without indecency. Sometimes, the younger ones would dive under the surface, eyes closed, feeling the mud between their toes. The rush of cool water, a momentary escape from the relentless heat. For those few minutes, they could forget the world above, the smell of sweat, the chores waiting at home, the expectations of modesty and labor. Afternoons were quieter. The old women sat near doorways, fanning themselves with woven reeds. Younger ones tended gardens or spun wool in the shade. There was no escaping the heat, but they learned to move with it. They kept pitchers of water cool in cellars or clay pots buried halfway in the ground. Some mixed the water with vinegar and honey, a primitive tonic to refresh the body. When the sun began to fall, the village changed rhythm. The air cooled slightly, and life returned to motion. Evenings were the time for washing feet and faces, a small ritual before night. Water was fetched again from the well, and basins were shared among family members. The women often washed last, using what was left. They would wipe away the day's grime with slow, careful movements, whispering to children to hold still as they cleaned them. The sound of dripping water and quiet conversation filled the dim cottages. Outside, the crickets began to sing. The smell of smoke lingered always, from hearths, from torches, from life itself. It mingled with sweat and herbs, creating a scent that would be foreign to modern noses, but familiar, comforting. To those who lived then, there were no mirrors, only reflections in water or polished metal. A woman might see her face in a bucket and notice the lines the sun had drawn upon her. She would smile, perhaps, or simply turn away. Vanity was for the noble, for those who could afford scented oils and clean linens daily. For the peasant women, beauty was endurance, the strength to rise each morning and face another day of labor beneath the sun. Sometimes, at night, the air inside the cottages grew unbearable. The heat trapped within the walls refused to leave. Women slept lightly, turning over straw mattresses to find a cooler patch. They loosened their hair, unwrapped their layers, and lay still beside their families. The sounds of the night were close: the rustle of mice, the creak of wood, the distant bark of a dog. Sweat gathered again on their skin, but they did not complain. It was simply life, a world before the comfort of soap, before the hum of fans or the cold whisper of water from a tap. In the monasteries, life was a little different. Nuns followed strict routines of cleanliness, symbolic purity more than physical comfort. They washed their hands before prayers, their faces before dawn. But full baths were rare even there. Some believed that bathing too often opened the body to sin, to sickness, or to vanity. So they used linen cloths, just as the villagers did, and prayed that their spirits would be cleaner than their skin. Yet, even in those quiet stone halls, the heat of summer was inescapable. Sweat soaked their habits. The air hung still, and candles melted unevenly upon the altars. The noblewomen of castles faced another kind of challenge. Though they lived surrounded by servants and finer materials, they too suffered the same heat. Their gowns were heavier, their chambers filled with the same air. Servants brought them bowls of scented water to wash their hands and faces. They used powders of ground flowers and rice to mask the shine of sweat, and perfumed oils to soften the smell of their bodies. Still, beneath all that finery, they were human, warm, tired, and longing for relief. Sometimes, they would sit by narrow windows, letting the faintest breeze touch their skin, while below in the courtyards, the peasants carried buckets, fetched water, and lived as they always had, everywhere, the rhythm was the same: morning work, midday stillness, evening cleansing. The women found comfort in routine, in the small acts that made life bearable. A basin of cool water, the scent of mint leaves crushed between fingers, the whisper of linen drying by the door. These were the luxuries of the medieval summer, and though the world around them was harsh and unwashed, they carried within them a quiet grace, the strength to find dignity in the midst of heat, labor, and dust. When the first rains of autumn finally came, it was not just the earth that breathed relief. The women did too. The air grew soft again, the wells filled, and the nights cooled. But every summer, for generation after generation, they faced the same sun, the same unending days, and found their own ways to remain clean, alive, and human without the modern comforts we take for granted today. As the summer deepened and the days stretched endlessly, life in the village found a rhythm that pulsed with both fatigue and resilience. For the women, the long heat was not just a test of the body, but a test of the spirit. In those narrow lanes lined with thatched cottages, companionship became a quiet salvation. The air might have been stifling, but the sound of voices, laughter, and shared burdens carried through it like wind through wheat dot in the early afternoon. When the men labored in the fields and the children hid in the shadows of barns, groups of women gathered near the wells or beneath the sparse trees that offered a trembling patch of shade. Their faces glistened, their hair damp beneath linen veils. Yet, there was something alive in those gatherings. They spoke softly, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with bursts of laughter that cut through the still air. They spoke of the harvest to come, of the aching backs, of husbands who snored through the heat, of children who refused to sleep. They spoke of the sky, of the moon, of the simple things that made life bearable. And between their words, there was a kind of music, the shared hum of endurance, friendship. In those days was survival, without soap, without cooling baths, without clean changes of clothes. The body was always close to discomfort. Yet, it was in that discomfort that intimacy bloomed. They brushed flies from each other's faces, tied one another's hair, lent a shoulder to lean upon. When one woman fell ill from the heat, others would come quietly, bringing cool water and wet cloths. There was no doctor, no remedy, only care. And in that care, a different kind of cleanliness was born, one of compassion inside their homes. Life continued with the same ritual rhythm. The oldest women became the keepers of wisdom, not written in books, but passed through stories and gestures. They knew how to keep water cool beneath the floor, how to boil herbs to calm fever, how to use vinegar and ash to cleanse wounds or skin. They taught the younger women these small arts, speaking in slow, measured tones as they stirred wooden bowls or crushed leaves between calloused fingers. These acts were never called science or medicine. They were simply life, and in the heat of summer, they became sacred. The evenings, though still warm, offered a brief reprieve. Families sat outside, under a sky streaked with the colors of dusk. The smell of smoke mixed with the scent of earth cooling after the long day. Women sat with their hands still busy, spinning, mending, shelling beans. But their minds began to wander. Stories floated between them like fireflies, tales of saints and sinners, of faraway lands, of girls who dared to dream beyond the village walls. Some laughed at these stories, others fell silent, eyes reflecting the fading light, imagining for a moment what it might be like to live a life not bound by heat and labor. For the younger women, summer carried another weight: expectation. The season of work was also the season of marriages. Fairs and gatherings took place after harvest, and matches were made between families. Many girls spent the hot months preparing linen for dowries, sewing with fingers slick with sweat, dreaming of homes they had never seen. There was excitement, yes, but also fear. The older women would tell them, half joking, half warning, that marriage brought its own kind of heat, the labor of tending not only to the body, but to the heart of another dot at night, when the world was quiet and the crickets sang their endless song. Women lay awake beside sleeping children, staring into the darkness. The mind, freed from work, wandered through thoughts too heavy to share in daylight. They thought of those who had died in past summers, from fever, from childbirth, from thirst. They thought of the river that dried too soon, of the animals panting in their stalls, and they thought of themselves, of what it meant to live in a body that was both a vessel of strength and a cage of endurance. Some whispered prayers into the silence, words not found in any holy book, but made of pure longing for rain, for rest, for one cool morning. Sometimes the storms would come, distant thunder, then wind. Then the sky would open and the rain would fall in thick, heavy drops that turned the dust to steam. The women would rush outside, lifting their faces to the sky, letting the rain soak through layers of linen and skin. Children danced, laughing wildly, and for a few moments, the world was cleansed. They knew the feeling would not last. The mud would dry, the heat would return, but still, the rain felt like mercy. In that brief baptism of the earth, every hardship seemed worth it. Within the stone walls of monasteries, nuns too awaited such storms. They knelt in prayer, eyes closed, but their hearts lifted when the wind cooled the chapel air. Even their sacred discipline could not erase the humanity of the heat. They too sweated beneath their habits, their hands trembling as they wrote by candlelight. One of them once wrote in a journal words that still survive: "We are made of the same clay as the road, and the sun softens us alike." She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the summer was a mirror. It showed people what they were made of, what they could bear. Among the noble classes, gossip became a form of survival. In shaded courtyards and dim chambers, women whispered over fans made of feathers. They spoke of each other's perfumes, of the queen's health, of lovers and politics, of how unbearable it was to wear silk in this heat. Servants fanned them, offering cool wine or water infused with petals. But even those small comforts could not hide the truth. Everyone, from peasant to princess, was equal before the sun. The sweat did not ask for rank. By the height of summer, tempers began to fray. In the villages, arguments flared easily over water, over bread, over whose goat had eaten whose grain. The heat made patience a rare virtue. Yet, even then, there were moments of forgiveness. A shared jug of water, a child carried out of the sun, a laugh that cut through the tension. In a world without luxury, kindness was the only wealth people could afford to give freely. As August waned, so did the strength of the sun. The evenings grew a little cooler, and women began to think of the work ahead, of preserving fruit, drying herbs, patching roofs before the autumn rains. Their hands never stopped, but beneath the exhaustion, there was pride. They had endured another summer. Their families were alive. The fields still promised food. They had carried water, firewood, and hope through the hottest days. And that, to them, was enough. In the final days of heat, before the first chill touched the mornings, they often gathered once more by the river. There was no celebration, no ceremony, only quiet acknowledgement. They washed their hands and faces, let their skirts float in the water, and watched the current carry away the dust of another season. They spoke little. There was no need. The bond between them was older than words, a bond forged through shared labor, shared silence, shared strength. When they returned home, they carried with them not just clean skin, but the memory of that brief coolness, that fragile peace. And though the world they lived in was harsh, their endurance gave it meaning. The summer might strip away comfort, but it could never strip away dignity. In that, they were richer than they knew. When the first breath of autumn touched the land, it came almost unnoticed. The mornings felt softer, the air no longer burned the skin, and for the first time in many weeks, women could walk without feeling the weight of the sun pressing down on their shoulders. The field shimmered in a different way, gold instead of glare, and the scent in the air shifted from dust to ripened grain. Life began to move again, slower, but with purpose. For the women who had endured the heat, this was a quiet rebirth. The heavy, endless days of summer had left marks on their bodies, darkened skin, calloused hands, and a fatigue that settled deep in the bones, but also a sense of victory. They had made it through. The first cool wind was more than weather. It was a promise. Early in the mornings, before the men stirred, the women stepped outside and stood barefoot in the dew-soaked grass. The earth was cold against their feet, shocking after months of warmth. Some of them whispered thanks to the dawn, small prayers not taught by priests, but learned through living. The mist hung low, and in it they found a kind of peace that no bath or perfume could offer. With the changing air came the work of transformation. The rushes that covered the floors were swept away, replaced with new cuttings that smelled of autumn fields. The herbs hung from rafters, rosemary, thyme, sage, drying slowly, their fragrance filling the cottage. Women sorted through what was left of summer: wilted flowers, empty baskets, worn linen, and memories. They repaired what they could, patched what was torn, and folded everything with a sense of closure. For the first time in months, fires were lit again in the mornings. The smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, carrying with it a faint sweetness. Women warmed water not just to clean, but to soothe. They soaked their feet, rubbed their hands, and washed their faces without haste. It wasn't luxury, it was gratitude. To feel warmth without suffocation, to breathe without strain. These were small blessings, but in their world, small blessings meant everything. The children returned to the fields to gather the last of the berries, and women followed with baskets. The sun, though weaker, still kissed their faces, and they no longer feared it. They laughed again, freely, their voices echoing through the open spaces. The younger girls would weave garlands from late-blooming wildflowers, their fingers stained with color. The older ones would watch, smiling faintly, remembering summers of their own youth when they too had dreamed beneath such skies. In the cool evenings, the village came alive in a way it hadn't for months. Neighbors visited each other's cottages again. They shared bread, traded dried herbs, and told stories beside small fires. Women, for once, allowed themselves to rest a little longer after supper. They stretched their hands toward the warmth of the hearth, listening to the familiar crackle of wood. The sound was comforting, the sound of return, of life finding balance again. Some nights, they sang old songs that told of harvests long past, of love lost and found, of the turning of the world. The younger ones listened, eyes wide, learning the words they would someday pass on. In those moments, the village felt almost outside of time. The stars seemed closer, the darkness kinder. Even the air inside the cottages smelled different, less of sweat, more of earth and smoke. For women, autumn was not just a season of rest, but of rebuilding. They began to prepare for the coming cold, washing the thicker linens, sewing new layers, repairing old shoes. They cleaned the hearths, sorted grain, and stored apples and onions in clay jars. Their movements were slower now, but deliberate, practiced, and filled with memory. Every task carried the rhythm of generations before them dot in the dim corners of their homes. They took time to mend themselves too. Some rubbed oils made from pressed nuts or herbs into their cracked hands. Others washed their hair with vinegar and rainwater, then combed it gently by candlelight. The smell of burning tallow mixed with lavender leaves created a strange harmony, half harsh, half soothing. And as the firelight danced on their faces, they looked a little younger, or perhaps simply more alive. Conversations turned inward during this time. Women spoke not of the heat or the harvest, but of things deeper, of children growing too quickly, of aging parents, of hopes that had gone quiet during the summer. There was a softness to their voices, a tone that came only when the world itself seemed to exhale. The old women told stories again, of years when the heat had been worse, when rains came too late, or when the rivers had dried to mud. They spoke not to frighten, but to remind. "We have always endured," they would say, "and we always will." Their words carried the weight of truth, the kind that only comes from living through too many summers and too many losses. The younger women listened in silence, learning without realizing it that survival was not strength alone, but acceptance, the quiet understanding that life would always demand and take, and yet give something back, if only patience. By late autumn, the last traces of summer had faded. The walls of the cottages were lined with bundles of herbs, dried flowers, and hanging roots. The women moved more slowly now, wrapped in thicker garments, but their spirits were lighter. The earth outside turned brown, the wind sharpened, and the sky grew low. Inside, warmth and laughter held the cold at bay. Sometimes, when they looked back on the long summer, it felt like a dream. The unbearable heat, the heavy air, the endless days of sweat and labor, all of it seemed distant, as though it had happened to someone else. Yet, deep down, they carried it within them. It shaped the way they breathed, the way they looked at the changing sky, the way they found beauty in something as small as cool water on the skin. The arrival of autumn marked not an ending, but a kind of peace. The women who had labored and endured stood at the threshold of a gentler season, aware of their own strength. They did not speak of it. They did not need to. The knowledge lived in their bodies, in every scar, every wrinkle, every quiet breath. And as the leaves fell and the world turned once more toward winter, the women prepared, as they always did, silently, skillfully. with hands that had learned to carry life through every heat, every storm, every turning of the year. When winter finally arrived, it did not come gently. It crept first as a whisper, then as a steady hand that drew frost across the windows and silence through the fields. The same land that had once burned with heat now slept beneath a blanket of white breath and frozen soil. The air grew thin and sharp, and the women who had endured the burning summer now faced a different kind of trial, one of stillness, patience, and cold. For the first time in months, the days shortened. Dawn came later, soft and gray, and the village woke slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth of blankets made of wool and straw. Fires became the heart of every home. Women tended them like living creatures, feeding them with dry twigs and broken branches, guarding their embers as one guards hope. Without the fire, nothing survived. The heat that once tortured them was now something they prayed for. The rhythm of life shifted inward. The fields were empty, the animals huddled close, and the world outside grew silent. Inside the cottages, time seemed to slow. Women spent their days in the dim light near the hearth, spinning, mending, and preparing what little they had for the long months ahead. The scent of smoke and wool filled the air, and though the cold pressed at the doors, there was comfort in the closeness, in the sound of crackling logs and quiet voices. For many, winter was a relief from the exhaustion of summer. There was less to carry, less to fetch, less to endure. But it also brought a new kind of weight, the weight of thought. With work reduced and the world still, the mind wandered to places it had no time for before. Women remembered the faces of those lost in past winters, the friends who had not survived sickness or childbirth, the children who had grown too quickly. Grief, like the cold, seeped in slowly, unnoticed at first, and then all at once at night. The cottages glowed faintly with candlelight. The women sat together, sewing or knitting, their fingers steady even as frost formed outside. They told stories again, not of saints or kings, but of their own lives, of ancestors, of old beliefs whispered by their grandmothers. Some spoke of spirits that wandered the frozen fields, of souls seeking warmth. Others told of love that defied death, of miracles born from faith. The younger ones listened wide-eyed, clutching their blankets tighter, while the older women smiled, half in memory, half in longing. The cold made every small comfort sacred. A bowl of warm broth, a shared blanket, the laughter of children playing near the fire, clean water melted from snow, carefully heated in iron pots. They used it sparingly to wash a face, to soak aching feet, to wipe a baby's skin. The act of cleaning, though simple, felt almost holy in the cold months. It was a way of preserving not just the body, but dignity, a quiet defiance against the harshness outside in monasteries. The nuns felt the same chill through their stone walls. The cold reached even the holy, seeping into prayer halls and beneath robes. They prayed with numb fingers, their breath visible in the air. Yet, there was beauty in their discipline. They believed the cold was a kind of purification, stripping away the desires of the flesh. Each shiver, a reminder of their devotion. Each small flame, a symbol of divine mercy. In their silence, the season became something sacred. For the noble women in castles, the story was not much different. The halls were grand, but drafty. Fires roared in great hearths, yet the chill lingered. They wrapped themselves in furs, rubbed scented oils into their skin, and sat near the windows, watching snow fall across courtyards. They wrote letters they would never send, embroidered scenes of gardens they longed to see again. Beneath all their finery, they too were prisoners of the season, confined by walls, by expectation, by time itself. In the villages, however, life found ways to glow. On certain nights, when the sky was clear and the moon hung heavy, the women would step outside. The snow reflected the starlight, turning the world silver and silent. The cold bit their cheeks, but it also awakened something, a memory of freedom. For a moment, they could breathe deeply, filling their lungs with air that felt alive. The same women who had once sweated under the summer sun now stood beneath a frozen sky, their breath rising like smoke, their hearts steady. The body changed in winter. Movements became smaller, slower. The skin, pale and dry, told its own story of survival. Women learned to listen to their bodies, to rest when they could, to share warmth with others, to eat simply. Food was scarce, but shared meals were full of warmth. Thick soups of barley and root vegetables, bread baked in stone ovens, herbs from the bundles hung months ago. Every bite tasted like memory, like labor turned into sustenance. There were moments of laughter, too. Children making games out of snow, the slip and fall that drew sudden giggles, the gentle scolding that followed. Women found joy where they could, in the small cracks of hardship. A song sung too loudly, a shared secret, a story rattled for the 100th time, but still funny. Even in the coldest months, life refused to be silent. As the winter deepened, the fire became both companion and confessor. Women stared into the flames at night, their minds wandering beyond the walls of their cottages. They thought of the past summer, the sweat, the heat, the weight of the air, and wondered how they had borne it. Then they thought of the next one to come. They knew it would return, as it always did. But for now, the cold was their ally. It kept the world still, manageable, almost kind. When illness came, as it often did, they tended to each other quietly. No physician, no remedy beyond what nature allowed. Warm cloths, whispered prayers, a hand held through the night. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. But even in loss, they did not stop. They buried their dead in frozen ground, marked the graves with stones, and went home to tend the living. Life did not pause for sorrow. It folded it into the fabric of survival. By the late winter months, when the light began to change again, women could sense it. The first thaw, the first drop of water sliding from the eaves, the smell of soil returning beneath the frost. They felt it before anyone else, in their bones, in their breath, in the way they lingered a moment longer at the doorway before fetching wood. The promise of spring was there, faint but certain, and with it came memory, not of pain, but of endurance. They had survived another circle of the world, another heat, another cold, another year written quietly into their bodies. There were no songs sung for them, no records kept of their names, but the world they held together depended on their hands. The rhythm of their work, their patience, their quiet strength, it shaped everything. And as winter slowly loosened its grip, the women prepared again, as they always did, not with celebration, but with steady hearts. They gathered herbs, mended clothes, and waited for the first green shoots to pierce the earth. Life would begin again. The heat would return. The same cycle would test them once more. But they were ready. They had always been ready. For in their silence, in their endurance, the true story of the medieval world was written not in battles or kings, but in the steady breath of women who carried life through every season, through every hardship, through every turn of the sun. Time has a way of erasing the names of those who built its foundation. The chronicles of the medieval age speak of kings and battles, of crusades and crowns, but they seldom whisper the names of the women who held the world together in silence. Yet, if one listens closely, beneath the clatter of history's noise, their presence is still there. It lingers in the rhythm of daily life, in the shape of traditions, in the quiet strength that mothers still carry centuries later. The medieval woman did not live in glory. She lived in rhythm. Her days were measured not by clocks, but by the light through a window, the cry of a child, the ringing of a church bell. Her body knew the turning of the seasons better than any calendar, the burning of the summer, the stillness of winter, the scent of rain on soil. Her knowledge was not written in books, but stored in memory, passed from one generation to the next through the simplest of acts. How to knead bread, how to soothe fever, how to bear pain without surrender. Every morning, she rose before the sun and met the day as if it owed her nothing. Her hands were her tools, her endurance, her armor. She scrubbed, she mended, she birthed, she buried. And in the quiet between her labors, she thought not of greatness, but of survival. That was her victory. To live, to endure, to protect Dot in a world that feared the wildness of women. She learned to hide her strength beneath gentleness, to smile when her body ached, to speak softly, though her mind was sharp, to obey when her heart longed to rebel. But in her silence, she kept something the world could never take, a deep and unbreakable will. It was this will that carried families through famine, that tended the sick when plague came, that planted seeds when men went to war. Her world was not kind to her, yet she shaped kindness within it. When the air was foul and the water scarce, she found ways to make things bloom. When death visited, she kept the fire alive. When despair came, she sang softly, and the world, for a moment, felt safe again. These were not grand gestures. They were small, almost invisible, but they were everything, because it is in the smallest acts of care that civilization survives. The scent of lavender drying by the hearth, the taste of bread baked before dawn, the soft cloth laid across a fevered brow. These were her monuments, unseen, unrecorded, yet eternal. And though time has stolen her name, it could not erase her fingerprints from the story of humanity. Centuries later, the world would change. Soap would come, water would flow from taps. The labor that once took hours would shrink into minutes, but the rhythm, the heartbeat of her endurance, would remain. The same patience, the same quiet strength, the same understanding that comfort is not given, it is made. Modern eyes might look back at her life with pity, seeing only hardship, but she would not have wanted pity. She would have wanted to be remembered truthfully, not as fragile, but as fierce, not as oppressed, but as constant. She did not change history with sword or speech. She changed it by enduring what history refused to see. Her world was made of contradictions, beauty and filth, devotion and despair, light and endless labor. Yet within that, She carved meaning, the laughter of children, the calm of a shared meal, the moment when evening light fell through a window and painted everything in gold. Those were the moments that made her human, that connected her to all who came after Dot, and perhaps, in the deep places of memory, she knew that her story would live, not in books or monuments, but in the very nature of the people she raised, the tenderness of a mother's hand, the resilience of a daughter, the quiet strength of a grandmother who says little but sees everything. These are her echoes, still alive in us, centuries later. If we were to walk through those old villages now, the ones long swallowed by time, we might still find traces of her. A stone well-worn smooth by countless hands, a fragment of pottery once used to heat water, a faded scrap of linen buried beneath the soil, each one a relic of endurance, a whisper of a life lived fully within limits. The medieval woman did not ask to be remembered. She asked only for enough food to feed her family, enough warmth to survive the cold, enough strength to rise the next morning. And in that simple asking, she left behind something greater than legacy. She left behind the essence of humanity itself, the ability to endure, to care, and to find beauty even in suffering. Dot, in the long silence of history, her story continues to breathe. Every time a woman wipes the sweat from her brow, every time she holds a child close, every time she faces hardship and says quietly, "I can bear this," the past lives again. The same fire that burned in her hands still burns in ours. Gentler now, perhaps, but no less real. And so, as the centuries turn and the world grows louder with invention and noise, her memory does not fade. It hums beneath everything, the low, steady rhythm of creation, of care, of survival. She does not need to be seen to be known. Her story has already become part of us. Because history is not written only in words or battles or kings. It is written in the way people live, the way they endure, the way they love despite the world's indifference. And somewhere, beneath all that, beneath the dust of forgotten centuries, the medieval woman still stands, barefoot in the dawn, hands worn, eyes steady, breathing in the cold air, ready once again to begin. By late summer, the air itself felt heavy, thick with dust, with the scent of sweat and soil, with the weight of too many unwashed days. The ponds that once shimmered in the sunlight had begun to shrink, leaving behind green film and the stench of decay. Flies gathered in clouds, buzzing around every wound, every drop of spilled milk, every open pot. The sun had not relented in weeks, and for the women who kept the village alive, the heat became another kind of enemy, one that crept quietly into every home and body. Bathing was no longer possible for most. Wells had grown shallow, and every bucket drawn was measured like gold. A bath was a luxury only for the newborn or the dying. The rest washed themselves in fragments, a damp cloth here, a trickle of water there. Some used vinegar diluted with herbs, believing it kept sickness away. Others rubbed crushed mint leaves on their skin to disguise the odor of sweat. It worked only for a few hours, but in those hours, they could feel almost human again. Inside the cottages, women worked like ghosts of habit. They rose before dawn, lit the fire even when the heat was unbearable, and prepared the day's bread. Sweat ran down their backs before the first loaf had finished baking. The men had gone to the fields early, leaving the women behind to tend the rest, the infants, the sick, the elderly. The small ones cried often, restless from the heat. The old ones grew quiet, sleeping longer, their breath shallower. Life in the village was slowing, sinking under the weight of summer. Illness came with the flies. It started small, a rash here, a fever there. Soon, whole families were coughing. Some said it was the air, others blamed the stagnant water. The priest said it was punishment for sins left unconfessed. But the women knew better. They could read sickness the way others read scripture. They saw it in the color of skin, the dryness of lips, the smell that came before the fever. And though they had no medicine to cure it, they had the courage to stay near. Each woman became nurse, healer, and mourner all at once. They boiled herbs until the air filled with bitter steam, rosemary, thyme, sage, anything that grew strong despite the heat. They crushed wild garlic and mixed it with honey, pressing the paste against infected wounds. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Still, they tried, because trying was all they had. The young girls learned by watching. They fetched water when no one else could bear to. They soaked linens, wiped sweat from their mothers' faces, and whispered prayers they did not fully understand. It was through such days that childhood faded quietly into womanhood. No ceremonies marked the change, only the calluses on the hands and the look in the eyes. The silent knowing that life demanded strength for beyond one's years. At night, when the heat softened and the crickets began to sing, the women would sit outside their homes, tired beyond words. They spoke little. The firelight flickered over their faces, revealing exhaustion and resilience in equal measure. Sometimes one would hum an old song, low and slow, the kind sung to babies. Others joined softly, their voices blending with the hum of night. It was not joy, but something close to peace. For a few moments, they remembered what it felt like to simply be. Beyond the village, fields shimmered with dying crops. The barley turned brittle, the cabbages wilted in their rows. Men cursed the sky, prayed for rain, and came home with tempers as raw as the earth beneath their feet. When they argued, the women did not answer. They had already learned that anger was another kind of weather, fierce but passing. What mattered was survival, not victory. Sometimes, travelers passed through. Peddlers, monks, or beggars moving from one town to the next. The women always noticed them first, standing at the edges of the road, eyes cautious. Strangers could bring word from the outside world, or they could bring disease. Still, hospitality was sacred. A bowl of broth was offered, a loaf of bread shared. No one left hungry, even when there was barely enough for those who lived there. As the days dragged on, the smell of smoke began to drift from the nearby woods. Fires had started, small ones at first, then larger. The ground was too dry, the wind too strong. Fear spread through the village like the fever itself. Women began to pack what little they had: wool cloaks, bread, a jug of water. They knew what fire could do. They had seen it before. The memory of loss never left them. It only slept. One evening, as the horizon glowed red, a mother stood by her doorway watching the sky. Her daughter clung to her skirt, frightened by the strange light. The mother did not speak. She could feel the heat, even from a distance, and knew the fire would come closer before it was done. Behind her, her home, small, smoky, filled with everything she had ever known, stood still and silent. She took one last look, then whispered a single word that no one heard, and turned away. That night, they fled. The men carried what tools they could. The women carried everything else: the infants, the pots, the memories. The road was long and dark, but they walked together. In the distance, the burning forest roared like the voice of God. Sparks fell from the sky, landing in their hair and clothes. And still they kept walking, because in the medieval world, there was no other choice. You walked or you burned. By dawn, the fire had passed. Smoke hung over the hills like a ghost. The women looked back at what was once their home, blackened, silent, and gone. No one cried. There was no time for mourning. Instead, they began to build again. Stones were gathered, timbers dragged from the edges of the woods. Life demanded motion, and so they moved. And when the first pot of water boiled again, when the first loaf rose from the ashes, when the first baby laughed amid the ruins, they knew that survival had meaning, that no matter how cruel the summer had been, it had not broken them. It had tested them, stripped them, burned them, but it had not destroyed them. And perhaps that was all that mattered. For even in the hottest summer, in the darkest night, the women of that world carried something no fire could consume: the will to continue. Morning came with a strange stillness. The smoke that had hung in the sky for days was finally thinning, drifting into a pale gray that blended with the dawn. The air smelled of ash, yet beneath it, there was another scent: wet earth, new beginnings. For the first time in months, the wind carried the promise of rain. The women looked up, faces streaked with soot and exhaustion, and watched the clouds gather like an answered prayer. The fire had taken everything: homes, grain, tools, the small tokens of life that gave meaning to their days. Yet, among the ruins, there was no silence of defeat, only the soft murmur of work beginning again. It was the women who started first. While the men argued about what to rebuild, the women simply began. They gathered charred stones from the ruins, sorted the ones that could still be used, and stacked them into rough walls. Their hands were blistered, blackened, but they did not stop. The sound of hammers and wooden mallets soon filled the valley. Smoke still curled from the scorched earth, but life was returning, heartbeat by heartbeat. There was something sacred about their labor, not desperate, but deliberate. Every nail driven, every pot mended, every loaf baked felt like defiance against oblivion itself. In the evenings, after hours of rebuilding, the women would gather near the stream that had once fed their fields. The water was murky and slow, but it was alive. They washed their faces there, wiped the soot from their arms, and sat together in the cool air. Their conversations were quiet, their laughter faint but real. Some braided each other's hair, untangling strands still smelling faintly of smoke. Others simply watched the sky. For the first time in a long while, stars were visible again. Children played near the ruins, their bare feet kicking up dust where walls once stood. They did not remember the fire as the adults did. They remembered only the moment when everyone held hands and walked through the night. To them, the village was not destroyed. It was just changing shape. The women watched them and saw hope, not the bright kind sung in prayers, but the slow, patient kind that takes root even in burned soil. Water became the new measure of wealth. Every drop drawn from the surviving well was guarded carefully. Buckets were lowered with prayer, lifted with gratitude. The women learned new ways to stretch the little they had. They boiled wild roots into stew, dried herbs for the winter, and used linen scraps to filter water before it touched a child's lips. Cleanliness had become not just a matter of comfort, but survival. And still, in the evenings, they found moments for care, washing feet before sleep, brushing hair, soothing burns with honey and cool ash. A few weeks later, the rains finally came. It began as a drizzle, hesitant, as if testing the ground. Then, as thunder rolled through the hills, the skies opened. The rain fell in sheets, washing away soot, cooling the cracked earth, drumming against the new roofs like applause. The women stood in it with their faces lifted, laughing, crying, unashamed. Children danced barefoot in the mud, spinning and shrieking with joy. For once, no one told them to stop. The fire had taken everything, but the rain had given something back. A reason to believe that the earth still remembered them. In the days that followed, the village began to breathe again. The fields, once gray with ash, turned dark and rich. Tiny green shoots appeared, fragile but alive. The women planted seeds with hands that had buried too much, and for each seed, they whispered a wish, not for wealth, not even for peace, only for enough. Enough to live, enough to rest, enough to see another season. They built new homes closer to the stream this time. The walls were lower, simpler, but stronger. Lessons from the fire lived in every brick. Windows were smaller to keep out heat, roofs angled to shed rain faster. There were no architects, no blueprints, only memory, experience, and instinct. The women's hands guided the rebuilding more than any man's plan. At night, when the moon hung low over the valley, they told stories to the children, not of heroes or kings, but of survival. They spoke of the summer when the sun would not relent, of the sickness that came, of the fire that chased them through the dark, and of how they rebuilt when all seemed lost. The stories were not meant to frighten, but to teach. Each tale carried a lesson. That strength was not born in comfort, but in endurance. That even the smallest kindness could outlive a storm. The priest, when he finally returned from the neighboring town, called it a miracle. He said God had tested them and found them worthy. The women bowed their heads politely, but did not answer. They had learned that survival did not come from divine favor. It came from their own hands, their own sweat, their own quiet will. Faith was good, but work was better. The months passed. The scars of fire faded, replaced by the smell of baking bread, the laughter of children, and the hum of spinning wheels. When travelers passed through, they were surprised to see how alive the village was. "It looks new," one said. A woman, standing by her doorway, smiled faintly. "It is," she replied. "We built it that way." But even in this new life, the memories lingered. Every time the wind carried the scent of smoke, hearts quickened. Every time the sun burned too long without rain, fear stirred quietly beneath the surface. The women felt it most. They had seen too much, lost too much, to ever forget. Yet, they carried that fear like they carried everything else. Not as a burden, but as a warning, a reminder that life was fragile and sacred. One evening, as the sky turned the color of honey, a young girl asked her grandmother, "Why do you still keep the ashes in that jar?" The old woman smiled softly, her eyes tired, but kind. "So I don't forget what we survived," she said. "And so you never think it was easy?" The girl nodded, not fully understanding. But years later she would, because stories like that do not fade. They become part of the soil, the air, the rhythm of life itself. And as the night settled over the rebuilt village, and the sound of crickets returned to the fields, one could almost hear something else beneath it all, the low hum of resilience, steady and ancient. The same hum that had carried women through plagues and droughts, through fire and loss. Through every cruel season the world had to offer. In that sound, history lived, not as a tale of kings and kingdoms, but as the quiet, enduring truth of those who rebuilt when no one was watching. The village had changed. Where once the fire had reduced everything to ash, new roofs rose, fresh earth tilled, and children's laughter returned to the streets. Time, relentless and patient, had stitched the wounds left by summer's heat and the fire's fury. But even as life regained its rhythm, the memory of hardship lingered like a shadow in the corners of every home. The women who had endured the blaze were older now, their hands marked by work and survival, their eyes carrying the quiet weight of history. It was these women who shaped the next generation, the daughters born before the fire, and those who had come after, grew up under their careful watch. They learned not from books, for few were written, nor from kings or priests, for their lessons were distant. They learned from the rhythm of labor, the steadiness of patience, the art of seeing what needed to be done and doing it without complaint. The older women taught them how to cook in scarce conditions, how to stretch water and grain, how to soothe the sick, and how to carry loss without surrender. Every lesson was practical, every word a seed that would bloom only years later. By summer, the sun returned as it always did, but the girls of this new generation faced it differently. They had learned from the women who survived fire, plague, and famine. They wore lighter garments, yet moved with the same caution, understanding that heat was both enemy and teacher. They carried water carefully, cleaned themselves with the same care, and performed every daily task with the dignity of one who knew that life was hard, yet worth enduring. In their hands, simple chores became rituals of resilience. The air still carried the memory of suffering. Dust clung to the stones. The rivers were slow, and the flies returned in swarms. Yet, the girls moved through it as if it were normal, unafraid. They had been taught that the world offered nothing freely. Comfort was earned in sweat, in patience, in the kindness extended even when it was inconvenient. And they were good students. They learned to see value in what others overlooked. A patch of shade under a tree, a drop of rain collected in a leaf, a loaf of bread shared quietly at dusk. The older women, now grandmothers in many cases, watched quietly. They noticed how the daughters carried themselves differently than the daughters of their own youth. There was confidence, a certain fire in their eyes tempered by knowledge. They did not complain about heat or toil as often. They bore it with a calm born of inheritance. Every mark on their own skin, every scar, every blister, every line of fatigue had become invisible lessons, etched into the new generation without words. Sometimes, the grandmothers told stories by the hearth. They recounted the summer that burned the village, the illness that crept through households, the fire that forced them into the night. They did not exaggerate, nor did they embellish. They spoke plainly, letting the weight of truth rest in the room. The girls listened, some wide-eyed, some silently absorbing each lesson. And though the events were terrifying, they left the girls not afraid, but prepared. Fear had been tempered into wisdom. During the evenings, when work was done and the air cooled, the village women gathered by the stream once more. The young ones followed, dipping their hands in the water, feeling its coolness, marveling at its flow. The older women observed, noting the way they laughed, the way they helped each other, the instinctive way they shared resources. In every gesture, the same lessons repeated: resilience, empathy, and the quiet strength that had carried the village through every trial. The seasons continued their cycle. The long summers still came, and with them, heat and sweat. Winters returned, bringing cold and scarcity. But with every repetition, life felt steadier. The village, shaped by fire and endurance, became a place where survival was taught through example, where knowledge was passed hand to hand, eye to eye, breath to breath. The daughters grew into women who knew how to withstand both heat and hardship, who could carry the weight of family, who could work without complaint and love without expectation. And yet, there was more than endurance. There was creativity, laughter, and fleeting joy. Children played in the mud after rain, ran through fields in the morning mist, and learned songs by the river. The women made time for these things, understanding that survival was not only about life, but about living. They taught the daughters to find pleasure in small victories. The first loaf of bread rising in the oven, the sight of green shoots through blackened soil, the sound of a baby's laugh breaking the quiet of a long day. By the time the girls were grown, the older women were almost invisible shadows in the village, present in memory, in advice, in tradition, but no longer carrying the same burdens. The fire, the sickness, the scorching summer, these were chapters in their lives, not the whole story. And yet, in the girls' strength, those experiences lived on. The legacy was subtle, almost invisible, but unbreakable. It was written not on parchment, but in calloused hands, in measured breath, in the rhythm of daily work and care. At the end of each day, when the sky turned gold and the wind carried the scent of ripening fields, the village paused. Women looked at each other across the lanes, in doorways, by wells. No words were needed. They understood. They knew the battles they had fought were carried quietly, without acclaim, without song. And still, in every loaf baked, every wound tended, every child raised, they were victorious. As the years passed, the story became more than memory. It became tradition. The lessons learned in hardship, the patience honed through toil, the courage forged in fire, were passed to every generation that followed. The daughters taught their daughters. The knowledge of heat, disease, scarcity, and survival became embedded in the rhythm of life itself. And even as the world slowly changed around them, with new tools, new rules, new comforts, the core truth remained the same: that endurance, quiet strength, and the steady heart of women shaped not only their village, but the generations that came after. Finally, as twilight settled over the rebuilt village, and the stars blinked above like the eyes of ancient watchers, one could see the legacy in motion. Women bent over gardens, children racing past, the fire crackling in the hearth, laughter floating into the air. Every gesture, every breath, every whispered instruction carried the weight of centuries. They were not heroes sung of in poems, nor figures written about in history books. Yet, in the very fabric of daily life, in every simple act of living, their story endured. And so, the village thrived, not through grandeur, not through conquest, but through the relentless, unspoken courage of women who had survived heat, sickness, fire, and hardship, and who had taught the next generation to do the same. Through them, life continued, steady and enduring, a testament to resilience, love, and the quiet, unshakable power of human endurance.